For decades, the Soviet Union insisted on a simple idea: serial killers did not exist. They were considered a product of capitalist societies, places with inequality, moral decay, and weak social structures. In a socialist system, crime was believed to be different, individual, accidental, unconnected. But for more than 10 years, one case quietly proved that belief wrong. Police searched cities, villages, forests, and railway stations. Thousands of officers were involved. Hundreds of suspects were questioned. Innocent people were arrested. Critical mistakes were made. And while the system struggled to explain what was happening, the crimes continued. This is not just the story of one criminal. It is the story of an investigation that forced an entire country to rethink how crime is understood, how patterns are recognized, and how dangerous denial can be.
To understand why this investigation lasted so long and why it failed so many times before it succeeded, we need to understand the worldview behind it. In the Soviet Union, crime was not only a legal issue, it was an ideological one. The official position was simple: a just society produces fewer serious crimes. Violence, especially repeated or systematic violence, was explained as a consequence of social inequality, something associated with capitalist countries. This belief shaped police training, criminal theory, and even public messaging. Murders were treated as isolated tragedies, unfortunate events, personal conflicts gone too far. The idea that one person could repeatedly commit crimes over many years across different locations without being caught was not just unpopular, it was considered ideologically incorrect. This had practical consequences. Investigators were not trained to look for long-term patterns. There were no centralized systems for comparing cases. Local departments worked independently, often without sharing information. If a crime happened in one region, it stayed in that region's files. If something similar happened hundreds of kilometers away, it was treated as a completely separate event. In theory, this made sense. In practice, it created blind spots, and those blind spots would grow larger with every year.
Each murder was assigned to a local investigative team. Their task was clear: find the suspect for this specific case. They interviewed relatives, they questioned neighbors, they examined immediate surroundings. Once the case went cold, it was archived. There was no requirement to ask, has something like this happened before? There was no mechanism forcing investigators to look beyond their own jurisdiction. Even when similarities were noticed, they were often explained away. Different region, different victim, different circumstances. This fragmented approach meant that even obvious connections were rarely treated as meaningful. Years later, when analysts reviewed the files, they would notice patterns that had been visible all along. But at the time, those patterns were buried in paperwork, spread across offices, and hidden behind assumptions.
The individual at the center of this case did not look dangerous. He did not behave like the criminals described in training manuals. He was not aggressive in public. He did not attract attention. He worked ordinary jobs. He had a family. He lived quietly. This mattered more than many people realize. Investigations often rely on mental shortcuts. Investigators, like all humans, use expectations. They look for people who stand out, people who cause trouble, people who seem unstable. Someone who blends in too well often escapes notice. In this case, that invisibility was one of the most effective shields. Years later, investigators would admit that they simply did not expect someone like him to be responsible. In the late 1970s, troubling cases began to appear. Disappearances, unexplained deaths, bodies found in remote areas. Each case seemed tragic, but not extraordinary on its own. Different victims, different circumstances, different locations. There was no single event that screamed pattern. And because investigators were not trained to search for long-term behavioral consistency, they focused on immediate explanations: runaways, accidents, personal disputes. Only years later would it become clear that the similarities were not superficial, they were structural. As unresolved cases accumulated, pressure on law enforcement increased. Officials demanded results. Communities demanded answers. Investigators were expected to close cases, sometimes quickly. Under that pressure, mistakes happen. Suspects were detained based on weak evidence. Confessions were trusted too easily. Alternative explanations were ignored. One of the most tragic outcomes was the conviction of an innocent person. At the time, this was seen as a solved case. Only later would it be recognized as a devastating failure. That moment forced a painful realization: the system was not just slow, it was misreading reality.
By the mid-1980s, the investigation had reached a critical point, not because it was close to being solved, but because it was clearly failing. Years had passed. New cases continued to appear. Public pressure was growing. Yet inside the system, the same questions were still being asked. Who committed this crime? Who had a motive here? Who lived nearby this location? Each crime was still treated as an isolated event. What investigators were not asking was far more important. They were not asking why similar situations kept repeating. They were not asking whether the same behavioral logic was present. They were not asking whether geography, timing, and victim vulnerability might point to a single source. Instead, the investigation focused on local explanations. A suspect near a railway station, a disturbed individual in one district, a random conflict in another. This approach produced activity, but not understanding. In retrospect, this was not incompetence. It was structural blindness. The system was built to solve individual crimes, not patterns. And without acknowledging patterns, there was nothing to connect.
As the investigation dragged on, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Entire communities lived in uncertainty. Parents warned children not to travel alone. Rumors spread faster than facts. Inside the system, pressure intensified. Investigators were expected to produce results. Local departments were judged by closure rates, not accuracy. This environment led to one of the most tragic outcomes imaginable. An innocent person was arrested, convicted, and executed for crimes he did not commit. This was not an accident in isolation. It was the result of a system desperate for resolution, operating without the tools needed to understand what it was facing. Later reviews would acknowledge this failure, but at the time it exposed a deeper truth. When a system refuses to reconsider its assumptions, it begins to create its own victims. This moment quietly changed the tone inside law enforcement. Some investigators began to realize that the problem was not effort, but direction.
But the late 1980s, a small but critical shift occurred. Instead of asking, who committed this crime, some investigators began asking, what connects these crimes? This was a radical change. It required admitting something that had long been denied, that a single individual might be responsible for many crimes across different regions. To pursue this idea, investigators had to step outside traditional procedures. They began laying cases side by side. They compared locations, time gaps, environmental features, victim circumstances. Patterns slowly emerged, not obvious ones, but subtle consistencies. Crimes occurred near transport routes. Victims shared vulnerabilities rather than identities. The offender appeared to move, not remain local. This was not intuition, it was analysis. And for the first time, the investigation had a direction.
These new methods culminated in what became known as Operation Forest Strip. It was one of the largest coordinated investigative efforts in Soviet history. The operation focused on areas where crimes repeatedly occurred: wooded zones, railway corridors, transitional spaces between towns. Rather than searching for a specific suspect, investigators focused on behavior. Who traveled frequently? Who appeared in these areas without clear purpose? Who blended in yet returned repeatedly? Thousands of individuals were checked, not through mass arrests, but through observation and verification. This was slow, exhausting work, but it represented a fundamental change. The system was no longer chasing crimes, it was studying the person behind them. The eventual breakthrough did not come through drama. There was no chase, no confrontation, no public arrest. Instead, there was something far more important: consistency. Investigators noticed an individual whose movements aligned with multiple incidents. Individually, his behavior meant nothing. Taken together, it meant everything. Travel patterns matched timelines, presence overlapped locations, explanations became less convincing under scrutiny. Only after careful verification did the investigation move forward. This restraint mattered. It showed how far the system had come, from assumptions to evidence. After more than a decade, the investigation finally reached its conclusion. The trial that followed was unprecedented, not just in scale, but in what it revealed. Hundreds of volumes of evidence were presented, years of investigative decisions were examined. But the trial was not only about guilt, it became a public reckoning. How did this go on for so long? Why were warnings ignored? What assumptions prevented earlier action? The courtroom became a place where the system itself was quietly judged. The verdict closed the legal chapter, but it opened a much larger conversation. After this case, criminal investigation in the region changed permanently. Serial crime was officially acknowledged. Pattern recognition became standard practice. Behavioral analysis entered investigative training. Centralized data systems improved. Cross-regional cooperation increased. Perhaps most importantly, investigators were taught to question assumptions. This case became a foundational example in criminology and law enforcement education, not because of its horror, but because of its lessons. This is not simply a story about one criminal. It is a story about how institutions think, about what happens when ideology overrides observation, when comfort replaces curiosity, when patterns are dismissed because they challenge belief. The most dangerous failures are rarely loud. They happen quietly, gradually, systematically, and often they are only recognized after irreversible damage has been done. That is why this case still matters, not as a warning about individuals, but as a warning about systems.